Hi, this is a quick demonstration on how to deploy Checkpoint vsec in AWS. Now, what we're going to be doing in this tutorial is we're going to be doing everything from scratch, and this is a great resource for people that have no knowledge on how to do this within the cloud, whether it's Checkpoint or AWS or both. So what we're going to do next is we're going to create a VPC from scratch. We're going to create a front-end subnet, a back-end subnet. We'll deploy a Checkpoint vsec instance, which is going to be managed by an R80 manager. Once we do that, we'll launch a web server instance. And then we're going to redirect traffic to go through the Checkpoint vsec instance. Now, there are easier ways to do this. We have pre-built templates that will do everything for you, including the routing, the security groups, the subnets, and the source and destination checks option. So let's get started. Okay, first step. We're going to create the VPC, and we're going to create two subnets. So I'm already logged in to my AWS console. So I'm going to start with network and content delivery, and then I'm going to select VPC. So this is a brand new account, so I have nothing set up here, as you can notice. So I'm going to go ahead and start the VPC wizard. So I'll click on select, and what I have here is a CIDR block. Now, the reason why I have a /16 is because I want to be able to create additional networks inside this space. So my /16 would be this entire block. Within this entire block, I'm going to create additional subnets. So I'll go ahead and select the defaults, which is 10.0.0.0 /16, which is class C. Now, inside this subnet, I'm going to create my front-end subnet, and I can call it front-end subnet or external subnet. Let's just call it external subnet. All right, so we're going to create this VPC. So now I have my VPC in my CIDR block with the front-end subnet. Now the next step is I want to create a internal subnet inside this VPC. So I'm going to go ahead and select create subnet again, and then I will name this internal subnet. And the next network that I'm going to select is going to be 10.0.1. And this is going to be /24. So I'll select yes and create. Okay. Okay, moving on. So far, if we go back to our diagram, we have our VPC created. We have a front-end subnet and a back-end subnet. We're calling this external, and then we have internal. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to deploy our management instance. So let's go ahead and do that now. Also, if you notice, let me go back to my diagram. This process right here is created automatically by AWS. There is a internet gateway that's been created. So basically what that does is redirects all the traffic out to the internet. So it has a default route, and if we click on internet gateways, we see that it's been created already for us. So the next thing we're going to do now is we're going to deploy a R80 manager. So in order to do that, I'm going to go back to my main dashboard, and I'm going to look for EC2. I happen to have a shortcut already here, so I can either find it within all my options, or I can just go ahead and click on EC2. So EC2 is going to give me access to the marketplace in order for me to launch instances. Now the goal here is to launch 3 instances. One is going to be our web server, one is going to be our management server, and the last one is going to be our vsec instance. So I'm going to go ahead and click on launch instance. Within launch instance, I go to the AWS marketplace and I'm going to search for checkpoint. So there's 2 licensing models. One is pay as you go. This is based on utilization. And then the second model is bring your own license. So we're going to select bring your own license because we're just going to use the default 15-day eval license. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to deploy checkpoint R80 management. So since I haven't configured anything yet, I do want to go back and make some changes. Like I mentioned in the beginning of this video, we want to do everything from scratch and we want it to make it manual. So I'll go ahead and select the smallest instance I can. I'll configure the details. So by default, we need to tie this into the external subnet because we need to be able to tie this to an IP address that we can reach from the outside. We want to tie this to a availability zone, which is already selected. We do need an IP address, so I'll go ahead and automatically assign the IP address. We're not going to configure identity access management, so I'm just going to go with the defaults. Now I do want to specify an IP address within my external subnet in AWS. So this is going to be the 10.00 subnet. So I'm going to go ahead and choose 10.0.0.100 for my IP. Okay, so next we'll add storage, and I'm going to go with the defaults. And I'm going to name this R80 management. The next step is to configure a security group. Now, the security group already has the predefined rules needed for me to access specific checkpoint ports that are pre-configured, including management, SSH, and 443. So what I want to do for testing purposes, I want to create a new security group. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of these. And this is going to be a custom rule, which I'm going to allow all traffic. And it's going to allow everything. So I'm going to call this permissive. I can add additional details here where I can specify to run first time wizard for me and some other options. So I'm going to go ahead and launch. Now this is a very critical setup that you need to pay attention to. This is going to create my SSH key pair. Since I don't have one, I'm going to choose to create a new key pair. So let's call this my key pair. And we need to download. This is the only way we're going to be able to access our instances. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and launch my instance. If you do lose that key pair, you're not going to be able to access any of your instances, and you're going to have to create a new one and reassign. So since this is running, I'll show you how to create the key pair. So I'm going to search for putty-gen. I'm going to search for that key pair, which has my private key. Here we go. And then I'm going to save it. I'll save it to my desktop. So now as the instance is running, I want to be able to access that instance via SSH. Let me go back to EC2 and look at the instance status. So this is now building my R80 manager. When this is completed, I'm going to SSH to that IP, which is right here. I'm going to copy that IP to putty. Now I need to set the authentication. Within authentication, I need to point to the private key which I just created. Okay, so I'm all set. So let's give this a couple minutes to complete, and then we'll access and create our new Checkpoint R80 manager. Our new R80 instance is now completed. So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to name this R80 management and save. Now let's go ahead and configure this management server. I'm gonna open up putty, and I already have a save session that has the IP address, and the SSH key is pointing to it. So I'm gonna go ahead and open the connection, and I'm gonna log in as admin. The authentication is done by the private key, and I'm in the instance. Now the first step to do the setup is we want to change the default password. So we're going to do a set user admin password. Set a password for it, and we should be able to log in with HTTPS. I'm going to type in admin and then the password I just generated. And now I'm going to launch First Time Wizard. And this is going to be set up as a management server. So I'm just going to go with all the defaults. I can change the host name. Let's change it to CP Management. And then I'll take all the defaults. I'll use the same admin username and password. Be able to log in from any IP address. Click Finish and let this run in the background. Now, since this is running in the background, I do want to continue building my environment. So let's go ahead and launch another instance. This is going to be the vsec gateway. So same process. We're going to select bring your own license, as I mentioned earlier. I'm just going to grab the small instance. We're going to select the external network. Similar settings to our management. So on the outside subnet, which is the public subnet or the external subnet, I'm going to choose again an IP from the 10.0.0 network, and I'm going to choose 10 as my external network for this gateway. I can either go back and create a new subnet from the subnet option within VPC, or I can go ahead and create it here. So let's go ahead and create our internal network subnet. This is going to be 10.0.1, and this is going to be on the, you notice it's on the internal subnet. So next, I'm not going to change the settings for storage. I'm going to go ahead and launch. Now, I can modify and add different values if I want to, but I'm just going to go with the defaults. I'm going to edit the security group again and select the one that has everything allow for me. This is only for testing purposes. So let's click go ahead and launch. Now it's going to ask me for my key pair. So I already have an existing key pair which we created a couple minutes ago. So I'm going to select that. Once I have the external IP address, I'm going to use the same process to reconnect and configure the instance details. So since we're configuring instances, let's go ahead and launch our web server instance in the interest of time, so we can save some time doing this. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a pre-built image. This is a basic Linux. It's a micro instance. Same process. Now this one is going to be tied into the internal subnet. As you notice, my VPC name is external subnet. I should have called it something else, so don't pay attention to that name. So the subnet is going to be internal, and let's choose an IP address on the 10.0.1 network, which is internal, and let's go ahead and choose 10.0.1.5. Next, storage, not really that important, but the next step here is the security group, which I still want to go ahead and choose my permissive group, because I do want to allow connections on different ports. So let's review and launch. I'm going to use the same key pair. Okay, let's go back to EC2 and let's look at our running instances. I am now on the instances page, and my web server has completed building. It's running. I also have my gateway, which is running. But if we go back to our diagram, this is what we have. We still have no routing configured. Everything is has a default route to the internet gateway. So let's look at some of the architecture now. And you may have noticed that I missed a step when creating the gateway. So first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to name these instances. So I know that this is my gateway because of the IP address. Let's call this vsec. And save. Let's call this web server. Now, the step that I missed is I did not assign a public IP address to this. I did that on purpose in order to show you how to do that manually. So what I'm going to do now is I want to make sure that everything is named properly so I can always go back and refer to it by name instead of by instance ID. So let's take a quick look at network interfaces, and let's add some tags here. So let's go ahead and click this one, and this looks like the external subnet of the firewall. So let's call this external interface. If I select this one, this is the management interface. This is our web server interface. I remember giving it that IP, and this is our firewall internal interface. Okay, so we have tags, so we can always go back and refer to this. Now let's go ahead and create that external IP for this firewall so we can access it and configure first time wizard and connect it to our management platform. So I'm going to look for elastic IPs. I'm going to allocate a new address. Here's a new address. So now I'm going to associate this address with an interface. This is going to be my firewall external interface. And this is my external firewall IP, which is going to map to that external IP. So I'm going to go ahead and associate that. Now, I should be able to connect to it. So I'm going to use this IP 34.206.166.11. I'm going to select my private key. Go ahead and open. We're going to do the exact same thing we did with R80. We're going to set user admin password. Now let's go ahead and connect with HTTPS. And we're going to build an R7730 vsec gateway. Same steps. Take all the defaults. Let's call this vsec, AWS vsec. And we're going to create a security gateway only, not a security management. our SIC activation key. Actually, we refer back to our diagram. We have the architecture, but we don't have the routing. So since we already have the web server, there's no way for us to reach it. And the web server does not know how to route traffic through the vsec gateway. So once we're finished deploying our instances, we need to go back and change the route table and the source and destination check option, which I mentioned at the beginning of the video. The next step is to configure our R80 manager to communicate with this gateway, and we're going to create a policy to allow the traffic to and from the web server. Back to our diagram. So now we have our 2 checkpoint instances. We have a web server deployed, but we do not have the routing configured to go through the vsec gateway. So what we're going to do now is we're going to configure Smart Dashboard, connect to the gateway, and then we'll do the routes and we'll do a little bit of policy testing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to connect to our R80 dashboard. First thing we're going to do here is we're going to add an object. Let's create the gateway object. Let's call it AWS vsec. And we're going to use the external IP on AWS, which is 10.0.0.10. Enter our SIC key. This is going to import our topology. We'll click OK. We'll hit NAT, hide internal networks. From here we can select additional blade components. For testing purposes, we're just going to use the firewall blade. We'll turn everything on later. Let's create a couple of rules up here. This rule is going to be allow firewall management. Anything going to our vsec gateway and our manager, allow and log, and we're going to specify SSH, HTTPS, this is to make sure that we don't block ourselves from managing this gateway. This is actually the vsec gateway. What I'd like to do here is I'm going to allow HTTP I'm going to create a new service, call it PS SSH 1976. I'll explain why I have this in a second. And this is going to be access to web server. This is going to be internet out. Create a new network, internal. Alright, so I have a basic policy. So the idea is, rule 3 is for the web server to get out to the internet. Which this server should be behind NAT. Access to the web server, anything hitting my my gateway is going to be port translated to these different ports. So I need to configure a NAT policy to allow that to happen. I'll need 3 rules. Anything hitting the gateway on HTTP, I wanted to send it to my web server. So let's do HTTP first. I also want to do SSH on a different port. So anything hitting port 1976, I'm going to redirect it to SSH. And I'm going to use 8080 for something else, also for testing purposes. So all of these translated destinations are going to be my web server, which I'm going to create now. 10.0.1.5. So the port redirect is going to be 1976, is going to redirect to SSH. Alright, so I have my NAT policy and my access policy. Let's go ahead and push this out. And let's go back to our dashboard. Let's try to SSH to our gateway. See if we can ping the web server. Okay, great. Can we reach the web server on port 80? No. It still goes to the gateway. So now we have to wait for that policy to take effect. And we have to look at the most important step in the tutorial today. So what we want to do here is on the network interfaces for the gateway, we need to disable source and destination check. So let's do this one first. We have to make sure it's disabled, or else we're not going to be able to connect. Okay, that's the first step. Now the second step is, let's go back here, to change the routing table. So anything on this interface, we're going to need this number. Do a Control-C to copy this. We're going to go create a route table. To vsec. I can use this one since it's not being used, but I'll just go ahead and create a new one. So what we want to do here is we want to edit and create a default route. And we want to send that to the vsec gateway on the internal interface. Once we do that, we want to associate the internal interface. Now let's try to access our web server on port 80. We're going to be using the firewall's IP, which is going to be using pat. Oh, we did not install policy. Okay, let's install policy first. While we're doing this, let me go back and fix a minor change. This should be set to all internet. Back to my policy. Let's double check our policy. Rule number 1 is just access for anything going to my gateway and management server on HTTPS and SSH and CPM. This is to allow traffic and not lock myself out. Then I have a rule coming from the internet to the gateway, allowing port 80, 1976, and port 8080. I do have a NAT rule in place, which we just configured, and we verified traffic from the internet hitting port 80, send it to my web server on its original port, and then we have traffic from the internet going to port 1976, send it to my web server, and change it to port 22 SSH. So let's go back here, install this policy. Let's double check our work. We have our route in place, anything on the internal subnet 10.0.1, we have a default route, send it to the firewall. So let's open up a browser and test the connection to our web server. There we go. So we should be able to see this on our log server. Let's do a refresh. Here's the traffic. Let's test the second rule. Start a new session. Going to my gateway, I'm going to change the port to 1976, and it should redirect me to SSH on my web server. There we go. We're logged into our web server. Let's do a ping Google, and let's look at the traffic. Here's my web server, pinging Google. Right, so let's go back and enable additional features. Right. This concludes our basic tutorial for deploying Checkpoint vsec on AWS. We now have our VPC configured. We have a front-end subnet, a back-end subnet, a Checkpoint vsec instance managed by R80, and we have a web server that's been deployed behind our internal subnet, which is now going through the Checkpoint vsec instance, and now we have full threat visibility and management for this entire subnet. What I'd like to show you next is something I mentioned at the beginning of the video. We have templates that can do all the work for us. Let me show you how they look. If we look at SK article 111013, you can deploy different templates. For example, you want to deploy a Checkpoint vsec instance. You have management, you have a cluster. You just click on launch stack. This will take you to the specific template. It'll automatically link to your AWS console. Then if you click next, you'll be able to set parameters for your configuration. And if you click next, it'll deploy everything in CloudFormation within AWS. So we can create a separate tutorial for that. So this concludes our basic implementation. Thank you.